This is the AMP Business Podcast, a weekly show featuring the top leaders, innovators, and hustlers that are making it happen in Northern California. Here's your host, Chad Alderson.
With us today is the Executive Director of the Torres Community Shelter, Joy Amaro. Joy, how are you?
I'm great.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. We actually have known each other for a while, but then we forgot that we knew each other, and then we ran into each other again at where were we? We were at the Art Center building at the Chico Ca campus.
Yeah, the Homeless Forum.
Yeah. I was at the Homeless Forum, trying to prep for these series of interviews. I went in with the assumption that I would be able to kind of like put a bow on this in about 60 minutes of interviews with one person, and I quickly learned how naive and ignorant I am around this whole topic. It's pretty complex. This series of interviews will try to, basically bring in the players. They'll give their perspective on where things are at and kind of get an idea of where they're adding value to the community, where the gaps are, possible solutions, that type of thing. So thanks for coming on. Well, let's get in your background first, and then we're going to talk about the Torres Community Shelter. So where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Orange County, Garden Grove and Irvine. My dad was a colonel in the Marine Corps. We traveled 2 tours in Hawaii and the Philippines.
So you saw a lot of the world.
Not really. Just Orange County and Hawaii.
Orange County and Hawaii.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Orange County is pretty diverse in terms of, yeah. So what about the educational background?
Yeah.
Like where'd you go to school, all that stuff?
So I moved up here in 1992 and went to Chico State. Never left. I got my degree in child development. My minor is in human resource management.
So you business degree then?
Child development. Child
development, and then you did a minor in business?
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I haven't heard that track before. So how'd you get into the public service sector?
Well, my first job was for Glenn County Office of Education, and I was a preschool teacher for Head Start. And social services is a huge component to the Head Start, which is a federally funded nationwide program. And so helping low-income families, get back on their feet. So it's kind of a natural fit that I'm an executive director of a homeless shelter now. How
long were you at this first one?
Almost 5 years. Taught preschool. I was a site supervisor for a preschool. Opened an infant toddler center, state-funded infant toddler center in Glenn County. And then I went over to Colusa County for 5 years. Worked for the Office of Education there, ran all of their subsidized childcare programs, early Head Start, home base programs. And then I went to, became the first 5 executive director for Glenn County for 5 years, developing programming for birth to 5.
And then when the executive director position popped up on the Torres Shelter, were you already in the system there, or did you just kind of go in and get the job?
I was a stay-at-home mom.
And then this came up, and
I re-entered the workforce, and I had worked for a board for 5 years as the ED of First 5, and I just knew it was a natural fit, so I applied and interviewed, and second interview, third interview, and they hired me. So.
And then, so how long have you been with them again?
About 21 months.
Okay.
So I'm still a newbie.
Yeah, but it's still longer than, carrying a child to term. So you got some XP.
Yeah. XP.
Well, let's talk about the shelter and what it is that this particular shelter does here in Chico. Let's start with when was it founded?
So in 1998, the Greater Chico Homeless Task Force got together and realized that there was a need for sheltering. And they started off with a nomadic shelter, which was transitioned between churches for 3 months during the winter shelter or winter time. And so then it just evolved, and they knew that they needed something more. So they started looking for grants, and then the city had land that they provided, and so that's they built the first phase of the Torres Shelter where it's at now.
In '98, were there other players, or were there any other shelters in Chico at that time?
No.
And then were they doing pit surveys back then?
I don't know.
We're going to talk about what a pit survey is in a bit, but essentially it's pretty much, I think it stands for point in time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of gives you an idea of how many homeless people are in a given geography at a given time. Is that accurate?
Right.
Okay. That would be interesting to find out. So maybe
that would be just a HUD research. Just find out.
They'll know. Okay.
Just Google it.
Okay. Yeah. What's Google?
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll take a note to figure that one out. Okay. So back then, I'm trying to get a sense for, has the charter changed much since '98? Like during its inception, what was your charter back then compared to today?
Back then, it was definitely all about keeping people alive during the winter months. Warm bed, food, linkages to some social services, but not a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then it slowly evolved. When the shelter was actually built, they had approximately 55 people a night that they were serving. And then slowly but surely families started showing up, and the numbers just kept increasing. And their main focus was on linkages to services and not necessarily true case management.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely evolved. It's been 21 years now.
Okay, yeah, we're going to talk about what that term means, case management, in a bit as well. Okay, so the charter back then, it sounded like it was more on a needs, low Maslow hierarchy needs, just bed and warmth and some shelter, right?
And food.
And now since then it's gotten more, it still does that, I assume, but there's also a component that, have you guys like specialized more for families, or would you say, or is it individuals, or is it a mixed bag?
It's definitely a mixed bag because it ebbs and flows every day. Our demographics change. So in late 2016, we had 50 children under the age of 18 staying with us. So our capacity is 160. So that was,
in terms of beds?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was a third of our population were children. Well, right now I only have about 15 to 20. So
do you, because of that the adolescent component, or the child component in the population, are you fairly strict on who you let in because of that?
Right. So we do background checks.
Okay.
We don't allow 290s.
What's that mean?
Anyone that's on Megan's Law.
Okay. So pedophiles, basically.
Registered sex offenders. Arsonists is another. And then like violent felons.
When, how does that process work if, someone comes in for the day, if it's a fairly transient population that's coming in and out, I assume when they're new, there's some sort of registration process and some sort of a buffer to do the research, the background checks and all this to make sure that they meet all the criteria for you guys. Is that right?
Yeah, so upon entry, they complete an intake form, which generates all of their demographics. But prior to that is when we do the background checks. We check the Superior Court website. We check Megan's Law to see if they're registered.
And does that happen like the same time they walk in?
Yes.
So it's just right then and there. You do the check really quick. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. So the charter, we covered the charter. In terms of, measuring success back then, I think was pretty clear. Like, it's just basically make sure nobody dies, especially during the winter season. How have the metrics for success changed? Like, what's your metric for success now? Like, how do you guys measure whether or not you're doing a good job?
Well, we have measurable outcomes, and those fall into different categories. The primary one is the number of people that we've permanently housed. So we 10% is considered good nationally, and we average about 25% of our clientele we get permanently housed. 2018 was our best. No, 2017 was our best year, and we had almost 30%, a third of our clientele, which is almost 300 people.
So that's 30% of 300, or it's like 1,200 people.
900.
Whatever. Yeah, I'm great at math. I don't know. I have
we serve 900 unique individuals a year.
So 300 of those pretty much get permanent housing.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
It is.
And are most of these families?
No. Families are the hardest to house because they typically have, you figure, a one-person earner household, right? Wage earner, sorry, lacking the terminology there. That has to feed, 4 or 5 people. And then they also need more than just a 1-bedroom apartment. They may need 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms.
Right.
So the costs go up to house more than just a single individual. So it is a lot easier to find housing for an individual versus a family.
Yeah, it was a little counterintuitive to me to think that, because I would think that the mother and the father would be incented to like really try and, get a place for their kids and all that. But I hear what you're saying.
There's other barriers.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So how long does it take typically for somebody on those 33%, the time they breach the doors to the time that they're in their own kind of living situation, how long does it take typically?
Every case is different.
On average. Just tough to say. Is it weeks, or is it months, or is it years? It's months. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So one of the other measurable outcomes is housing someone within 30 days upon entry. And that is truly unheard of because last year, pre-fire, we had 1% to 2% vacancy rate in Chico and actually the county. And now it was reported in a meeting yesterday that we were like at 0.5 vacancy rate.
And you're talking beds, I assume?
Available housing. Vacancy
okay.
rate, vacant housing for people to rent, and then let alone low income housing for people to rent. And so there is none. So we're seeing another measurable outcome is length of stay. How long are people staying? And so on average, we were like 50 to 60 days. Now we're looking at 80, 90 days or even more. And that's not even when they exit. If they exit into permanent housing, it's just they're exiting somewhere else than staying at the shelter.
Yes. And you guys, because of the fire, you really do think the metrics in terms of pre-fire and post-fire, because I assume all your criteria for measuring anything is just thrown out the window as soon as the fire happened, because the situation on the field is way different.
It is. It completely changed. I mean, Chico absorbed 20,000 people.
Right.
And so then there was this stigma around, which is a whole nother conversation, of pre-fire homeless and pre-disaster or post-disaster homeless. Mm-hmm. And so there was the stigma that we can't serve pre-disaster homeless folks with certain kinds of money or available resources because they were homeless before the fire.
Okay. Let me unbox that. So the ones that became homeless because of the fire, but they had homes to begin with, they went up the priority chain because of that status. Is that right? Did I read that right?
That's how the community perceives it. Yes. But in the eyes of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, everyone's homeless. Doesn't matter if you're pre or post.
And I get it from the community perspective. It's a weird issue to deal with. Like, I've been grappling with this myself. I think my thinking on it was very, I would say, adversarial to start, and it was based on my own personal experiences. And I'll just give you an example. So I'm like really into fly fishing, super into fly fishing, and I spend a lot of time on the rivers and on the creeks. And what I see on the creeks and the rivers is like encampments. If you're in Redding, or if you're in Oroville on the Feather, encampment after encampment after encampment. I've seen people, defecating in the water. I've seen, garbage, all this other stuff. So, I consider myself a starter conservationist, if you will. I've only been doing fly fishing for 3 years, but it kind of led me to conservation. And it, I just really got angry, just seeing this. And so when I first decided to do this podcast around homelessness, it came from that experience. And then also, I've got a lot of friends that, have businesses downtown, or they have communities downtown that might be adjacent to some of where the shelters are. And I hear stories, and I went to lunch with a person of the day that she's a realtor, and she told me like one of her clients was on a short sale. It was kind of like his last ditch effort to get this home off the books, because he was, they were going to be destitute basically if he didn't turn this house over. And he put some extra money. He like put carpet in. He did a few things to kind of dress up the place a bit. And, somebody found out somebody was squatting it the night before she was going to show it. And the buyer backed out. The bank took the place, and the guy lost everything. And he's got a family. And these are the types of stories you hear that, there's roughly 100,000 people in Chico right now. 900 or 1,000 and change are homeless. And it's like this percentage of population is having an impact across the entire community on all strata, Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of anger from a lot of different people, but I understand, like, I'm starting to like wrap my head a little bit more around the situation from my very myopic view of it, based on just talking to different people, yourself included, and just getting educated on what the deal is, and it's a tough subject to talk about and parse when you have to come up with a solution, and the solution needs to be dealt with, amongst a variety of players, and it needs to be dealt with on as unemotional a level as you can do, because that's the only way to actually, make a negotiation and get people working together in a common goal. The human emotion, the raw human emotion for this particular issue is very high, though, and it's very challenging. And we saw that come out at this event at Chico State. It was pretty crazy to watch what happened. People were yelling at each other, not only in the panel, but on the floor. And I think I walked out probably a few minutes after you did. And it was my first experience in that kind of a situation. I was just like, holy shit, this is a huge issue. And I can't believe I thought I was going to get this done in an hour, So half the people that were on that panel are going to be on this series talking about this stuff. And it's a tough one to go through. And I'm not sure that I'm probably not the best qualified to do it, but I've got a platform that, anyone can leverage if they want to talk about it. I think that this particular issue in Chico needs its own show. I'll do a disservice to it over 4 or 5 episodes or 6 episodes, but hopefully somebody listening, if you want to take up the mantle and not politicize it and actually be focused on, problem solving, then I will be happy to support that. And I'll give you the studio space for free if you want to do it. But if it becomes politicized, I will revoke that offer. Anyway, I got off on a tangent there a little bit. So anyway, so in terms of the gaps that you fill, there's a bunch of different shelters in town. There's the Jesus Center, there's safe places, or is it spaces? I can't spaces.
Space, yeah.
I just learned all this stuff, so
the
still getting
Jesus
ramped
Center,
up.
just clarifying, serves 23 women and
Okay.
children. So when you say there's a bunch of shelters, there really isn't.
There
a
isn't.
bunch of shelters.
Okay.
So you think of, you have 1,000 and change people that are homeless.
Mm-hmm.
So they have 23.
Mm-hmm.
I have 100.
Only women and children.
Women and children.
Okay.
I have 160.
Okay.
That's men, women, and families.
Mm-hmm.
The Orville Rescue Mission has, I don't know, I want to say 60, but I could be totally wrong. And then Safe Space Winter Shelter has the capacity between 50 and 60, and that operates 3 months out of the year. So there isn't a bunch.
Okay. See, this was a perception I had, that there were all these there are all these services in town.
There are a lot of services,
there's-
but there's not a lot of shelter.
Well, okay, so delineate shelter versus service then, because I
Okay.
think I'm like, maybe I have some confusion there. Like, let's talk about that, because that might be part of what's driving my misconception.
Well, every service provider has its own mission. So mine is sheltering and housing.
Mm-hmm.
And other service providers are primarily housing of the mentally ill that are maybe come from my shelter, but they operate the housing, the apartment complexes, the projects, and provide wraparound services for these clients to keep them housed so they don't go back to the streets.
And can you define what you mean by wraparound services? Because that's a new term of art for me that I picked up during the course of, prepping for these.
So wraparound services is everything that you possibly can need to be successful. So it's mental health services, medical services, social services, whether it's employment, it's connecting them to get what they need, whether it's CalFresh, aka food stamps, disability. So one of the things that we do at my shelter is we have housing action plans, and I know I'm jumping the gun to case management, but okay. We have housing action plans, and it's all about stability. So you're looking at income stability, medical stability, and housing stability. All of the things that are going to make you stable when you're housed and before you're housed.
And assuming there's no addiction or mental health issues.
That's kind of wrapped into that.
Okay.
The social services. So addiction issues. I mean, the biggest thing is people that have dual diagnosis.
What is that?
Addiction and mental health.
And how often is that? Is that a lot?
It's a lot.
Yeah, because it seems like often addiction kind of begets mental health ishes. A lot of times.
There are a lot of people think it's the chicken before the egg concept, or the egg before whatever. And so what happens from that a lot of people are mentally ill and they're struggling with their mental illness, and so they will self-medicate. And then that's where the addiction comes into play. So
self-medicating being basically doing very low doses of whatever your drug of choice is, and then just slowly ratcheting that up over time. Is that essentially it?
Yeah.
And that's pretty much defines the opioid crisis in the U.S. too, correct?
Yeah, and alcoholism.
Yeah. Wait, alcohol's not a drug. What are you talking about? Okay. I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. Yeah.
I mean, nicotine, caffeine. Yeah. I mean, all of those are.
And I think it's an important note to think of the drug abuse thing as oh, well, if it's legal and I do it, then I'm not abusing drugs. But that's not a really good rational way to think about it. You're putting a foreign body into your system, whether that be an opioid. Thank you, third time. That your doctor prescribes you, alcohol that you buy out of the store, or crack cocaine. It's effectively going to have the same outcome over time if used inappropriately. I don't know where I was going with that, but okay. So in terms of the gaps in the system, and it sounds like you guys have the most bed capacity. You guys deal with, I would say, the largest, spectrum of issues. Is that safe to say?
Not currently. Because see, Torres was formed under the foundation that everyone comes through the door must be sober. Tim Torres was the man that was kind of the founding leader, if you will, back in 1998, and that was, he was big on sobriety.
Okay.
So everyone up until 2016 that walked through Torres's doors were clean and sober.
Yeah,
and we would do drug testing.
That was my next question. When you say sober that minute, or sober as in, multi-day sobriety?
Well, when you test, if you do a breathalyzer, immediately, right?
Yeah.
And then drugs, they would have to be, depends on how long it's in your system.
And that was in 2016. So then what happened?
HUD happened. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, came out with an evidence-based practice called Housing First. And Housing First is that there are little to no barriers to place people into housing. Housing also includes the sheltering. And so people we had to stop either drug testing to be in compliance to receive HUD funds. So what the Torres Shelter did, and this was pre-Joy, that we have a harm reduction program where people that do test positive are segregated into a different population.
But in the same building?
In the same building, yeah.
Separate access, everything? Or okay.
And so that's how we are working through that change.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not we're in compliance, but not the way like HUD would really like to see us. So one of the factors that's holding us up with making that true turnover is we still serve families. And as a mom, I'm protecting those little ones as much as I possibly can. I'm not going to let addicts run through the halls when I've got kiddos in there. So that's one of the gaps that you mentioned a bit ago, is the need for a family shelter. And so that is on the radar, and we're investigating funding and, locations for that.
Yeah, that's just sound, I'm just logistically and tactically, that's got to be challenging, doesn't it, from an operational perspective, to deal with those two types of tenants, if you will.
That's why they need to be
segregated. Yeah, absolutely. What's the timeline to have stuff like that happen?
Could be soon. Just there's some factors out there that I don't have control of, but that change could happen in a month. But
there's basically, as we speak right now, there's kids in your shelter that could, for example, here in the neighboring wing, a psychotic breakdown of one of the tenants. Is that accurate or no?
Yeah, but the psychotic breakdown doesn't have to do with drugs or alcohol.
No, but just they're screaming though. It's a high, very tense. We
have sober mentally ill people that go in full psychosis, and our children are watching that.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah.
Boy, I thought this was going to be so easy. Okay.
No, you need to come for a tour. Come hang out with me for a few days.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Got to collect my thoughts. Okay. Okay, so let's switch to funding.
Okay.
Where do you guys get your funding today?
About 50% of our funding comes from the state, Housing and Community Development, which is the state version of HUD.
Okay.
And then we get a small, very, very small percent from the federal HUD, and a little bit, yeah, I'm not very good with percentages here. The rest is private donations and or community, or I should say private foundations.
Okay.
So I could actually pull up percentages if you...
When we were talking about, after that Chico State thing, we were talking about HUD, I guess federally, they have certain criteria that you guys have to abide by in order to be open for funding, I guess, or what's the word?
Yes, that's true. Eligible.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm still kind of kicking around the last segment we just did. Yeah, so the eligibility for funding, HUD mandates certain things, and one of them is being on their case management platform, correct?
Yeah, the HMIS.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And then is the state the same way? Does the state require the same system?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of the private parties, either the corporate funders or the individual funders, do they have any criteria for you in terms of, what's their expectation? Like, how do you deliver value in their eyes?
It depends on
the
individual foundation's outcomes.
Okay. Is it mostly though around getting folks out of the system and into permanent housing?
It really depends.
Just depends.
Yeah, I was doing some research on some foundations, and it's just whatever they want to measure. It's whatever their foundation's priorities are.
Okay.
And then you try to match your operations to their priorities.
Yeah, and I guess that's really the crux of my line of questioning there is really around, if you have several different channels of funding and each one of those channels has slightly different criteria in terms of measuring how they measure success, then how do you come up with a game plan that kind of basically satisfies all these stakeholders?
So, in my opinion, you would follow the federal guidelines because those are the strictest. And so if you're meeting the federal standards, those are the highest, top, strictest regulations out there.
Okay. And I assume you tell anyone that you're getting money from that this is the standard that we're trying to hit. You're either, if you are on board, great. This is what we're going to measure. If you guys have your own list of demands, but they will take those into consideration, but it's really the Fed statutes that we're going to try and hit, or the federal direction that we're going to try and hit.
We would combine them. So not only would you indicate you would want to meet all of their outcomes for funding, but then you would also say, in addition to, if permanent housing wasn't a top priority for them, we would still report out. So all of our reporting standards are the same.
Okay. Yeah, and we in the tech industry, when I was at eBay anyway, we had this concept of a stretch goal. So we would have here's the 10 things that this project's trying to hit, but here's some 5 other things additionally that we're trying to hit. Would you consider the federal goals being primary, those 10, and then the stretch goals being the private funding channels, stretch goals?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It just really depends. It depends. Yeah. Some funding sources are all about food. How many meals did we provide? How many nights of bed sleep? And we provide over 100,000 meals a year, matched with over 100,000 bed nights sleep a year.
Okay.
If you look at us, if you compare how many occupancy rates some of the smaller motel chain, in the area.
Yeah.
We are larger than them.
In terms of just turnover and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the other folks in town, we the Jesus Center and then the safe places. Did I say
spaces?
Jesus. Safe spaces.
Just space, not space.
Safe space. Are they measurement wise from their donors and the places where they get their money? Are they evaluated on similar criteria? Do they have a similar? I guess my question is, do the three of you guys get together and come up with like, hey, as a service, as a public service, this is what we're going to try and hit across the board? And my question, it really comes down to a focus of effort, right? Because the type of I guess customer, if you will, that we're trying to get through a system that hopefully gets them on the road to being independent again. They're transient in nature, so they're going to touch your center for a week. They might end up at Laura's one week, right? Is there kind of a across the board, here's our action plan, or here's a list of goals that we're trying to accomplish, and then is the funding of it, right? The people that fund the different organizations, is there a commonality in terms of what they consider a good ROI for the money that's going out?
So
because it's an incentives thing, right? There could be this disconnect. And if the incentives are different from organization to organization, you guys are going to take a slightly different approach to how to solve the problem. But this gets back down to the case management. If there's no chain of custody between the different entities that are providing services in the area, then, and if the goal is to get a patient or a customer or whatever in the system and then out as quickly as possible within a 30-day time frame, if you will, there's got to be some continuity in terms of how that person's flowing through the system, right?
True. So if you look at my funding sources and what my regs make me do are different than what the Jesus Center and Safe Space, because they're not funded by HUD. So the Jesus Center at some point in time, and I don't know what year it was, decided to start using that HMIS platform. And they use
the same one you guys are on.
The same one I'm on.
Okay.
And Safe Space is in the process of implementing the HMIS software.
Well, that's a positive.
It is a positive.
Safe Space.
Yeah.
I'm writing it down so I don't butcher it again. Sorry, Angela. Okay. Well, that's good. That's actually a great thing.
It is. So looking at the navigation part, that is critical in the success to solve homelessness in Butte County, is having everyone on the same platform. The next step is allowing agencies to share data. And right now we're not able to share data.
Yeah.
And so we're working on that.
Yeah.
And that will be changed probably in the next 6 months. It takes time.
I want to unbox that a little bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about case management in general first. One of my first jobs out of college was working at a case management company, case management software specifically. We dealt with medical stuff. So it was like, if you go into, emergency and you've got high blood pressure or something, you go through that process. The software we built basically managed you through that process. Case management in this context is a little bit different, but it's kind of the same too, in that there's I like to use the word chain of custody, but somebody comes into the system, shows up at your shelter, for example, you onboard them. So you interview them, you do your background checks. The second you guys make the decision to commit them into the database, they have a profile in the system. And from that point forward, every time they interact with anyone in the staff with any significance, right, there's literally a historical kind of record kept of their process through the system. Is that the right way to frame it?
Yeah.
So what we're talking about, like from a case management perspective, and why it is important to have one that everyone's on, A, and B, everyone's sharing data, is super, super critical if you're looking at this from, basically a recovery standpoint, right? Whether that recovery is, from a drug addiction or getting somebody into a permanent housing situation. there's a variety of people and services, these wraparound services that you're talking about, right, that are going to come in and out of these people's lives depending upon what stage of the process they're in. So the database and the case management system is really intended to kind of shepherd them from an electronic standpoint through the system, so that if somebody at the, if we're looking at a 30-day engagement, somebody at day 29 that may not have any previous experience with this particular person can get up to speed quickly, do what they need to do, provide the service they're providing for this point in that engagement, and be done. Mm-hmm. So that's basically it. So if you've got a bunch of folks that are providing services, local services to the homeless community, no one's sharing data, no one's talking, it's a big issue. So it's analogous to if you go to a concert and there's a conductor at the front, but everybody's got different sheet music in front of them, it's going to be a total disaster, and there's not going to be any music coming out of that at all. Right.
Well, you're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
Basically, and spending so much more man hours and time getting all this information where you would have their history.
So there's going to be a lot of redundant interactions. Mm-hmm. That person is going to be very, very pissed because they're being asked the same question over and over.
It's a trust factor too.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Trust factor, and just building a rapport with that person's critical. If think of how frustrated you get the DMV, and then multiply that by 100. If you had to, you had to go to one place for the DMV to deal with your boat registration, and a different place to go deal with your car registration, and those two didn't talk together, so you had to tell them your address twice. That'd drive you through the roof. And I'm sure that the homeless experience from a management perspective is similar, mm-hmm. especially when people aren't talking.
Yeah.
Right.
So we are, there is an HMIS subcommittee of the Continuum of Care. And we are working on a release of information that is universal, that all agencies can use. Our biggest obstacle right now is the HIPAA requirements that Butte County Behavioral Health has to follow. So they're working through that on their end.
This is basically health record data privacy.
But we are still, as a group, moving forward despite that obstacle, because the rest of us can still share the data. Mm-hmm. So with client consent, we can share the data. So we are in the process.
And you said it's 6 months out?
I don't know.
Roughly. but this year possibly.
I think that's realistic.
Yeah.
I really do.
I mean, I think that if there's going to be any kind of, concerted effort to get anything done, this is actually foundational kind of work that absolutely has to be done. So it's super important. It's been fully funded. It's just basically getting people to buy on. Is that?
Yes. And then there's some service providers that don't have the HMIS software, mm-hmm. Which is obviously a barrier, and it's a funding barrier. They may not have the funding. And I don't know who has it and who doesn't, what the percentage is. But there's the 3 key shelters, myself, the Jesus Center, and Safe Space are crucial, so we can share and look and not start over 20 million times, because they are transient in nature. But when it shows on our software where, if they were here last year or 2 years ago, we track a lot of good data.
Well, that's very, very good. The other thing that I would add to that, from the community perspective, the folks that are, there's a lot of angst around any of this mm-hmm. stuff, is transparency. That kept coming up during my research, transparency and questions around what the true motivation is of these organizations. That, everybody, there's conspiracy theories that it's being run like a business, and I didn't see you roll up in a Maserati, so I don't think it's that. I think the people that are involved in this are actually, very empathetic. They're trying to do something, but it's a tough spot to be in. The transparency piece of it, I do see that side of it. Like, I understand, like, if I've got tax dollars going somewhere and I'm not seeing, I don't see any movement on the ground from my perspective. I still walk through the downtown park and see folks loitering about. I see, people sleeping in front of buildings. Then my personal experience is that my tax dollars aren't going to work for me. So when we talk about transparency, I think that there needs to be some system, like once the databases are set up and you guys are all sharing data, just like bed counts, just being able to go somewhere on the Chico website or somewhere where you can get bed counts and get an idea of where we're trending, what the average stay is. Are we getting stuff done this way? Just like basic infographics that kind of show the current state of the union, if you will, when it comes to this issue. It's there so people can do it, and there's no question around what the metrics are, because I think this is a big part of where this lack of trust is coming from, is just the perceived lack of transparency. And transparency from a data perspective is tough if you don't have the tools to actually do the queries in order to provide the data. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's actually happens all the time. There's just, even in a building, in a typical company setting, you can't just ask your accountant to like pull some crazy number off the books and expect it, in an hour. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes you got to get IT involved to actually expose the data. The data's there. That doesn't mean it's easy to get access to, which is kind of counterintuitive, but that's just how software works. So yeah, like some sort of a high level infographic that talks about, what the current homeless situation is.
I think that can happen.
That would be super cool.
So the Butte County-wide Homeless Continuum of Care has a website, and I think that would be the neutral party where us service providers could report our monthly data to that council, and which could then report out in an infographic, whatever.
Yeah, I would monthly. Take it a step further, and just, you don't even really need a human in the loop to do that. Once do the data integration, and then there's just a report that loads up automatically and creates itself based on the latest data. No one has to request it; it just pops in. If you're all in the same system, it's technically probably going to be feasible. And the data is going to would be rolled up on an aggregate basis, so there wouldn't be any personally identifiable information. You wouldn't have to worry about that either. Well, cool. Okay. Well, let's talk about the homeless person themselves. And how do you guys? I was using the word client or patient, but
it's guest.
How do you guys? Okay, so you refer to them as guests. Mm-hmm. All right. And does that vary from shelter to shelter?
No, I think it's universal.
Okay, well, that's good. Because if if you're not using the same terminology to define the person you're providing care for, the approach to the service may be different. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, in the shelter world, it would be guest, but in the permanent supportive housing world, it would be client, because they're a guest in my shelter versus, they're a client. Because they actually have a lease in their own home, but you're just providing supportive social services to them. And
what are the main reasons that people land in these situations?
Well, the demographics for the Torres Community Shelter is that approximately 25% of our clients are chronically homeless, which means that they've been homeless for at least a year, or 4 times over 3 years. So that's a definition that's derived from HUD. And so when you look at the non-chronic, a lot of that is like one check away. So something traumatic happened in their life that made them lose their housing. Mm-hmm. And so the ones that are non-chronic are easier to rehouse than the chronic The longer you've been homeless, the harder it is.
Yeah, and you were telling me that after that Chico meeting on the street, we were talking about that. And you said there was something around the brain's the physiology of the brain actually changes. What can you talk about that a little bit? Because I had never heard that before, and it just was tripped me out.
You're in that that survival mode, and you are in the state of trauma all the time, 100% of the time. And so your brain, I'm not a scientist, but it changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're doing whatever it takes just to make it the next minute. And so when you're getting to be adjusted to living on the street versus living in four walls, that is extremely difficult for someone that's been homeless for, let's say, 20 years. And just the fact of sitting idle is extremely difficult. Just to sit and watch TV.
Yeah.
Because every 20, 30 minutes, if you're on the street, you're being moved along because you can't stay there any longer. Someone's going to come bother you.
Yeah, the things that are kicking around in my head are somebody comes home from Iraq from being shot out every day, and then they're in their backyard just sitting there, when they come stateside again, they're sitting in their backyard and they're like worried they're going to get sniped.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have a rescue animal and that dog's been in a kennel for 4, 5, 6 months. There's stressors everywhere. There's people in and out of its life. And then you bring this dog home and it sits under the bed for 2 weeks. So I'm starting to, okay. Is that,
yeah.
Are those proper analogies or?
I would think so.
Yeah. And
I didn't know that. I didn't know that coming into this job. It was because I didn't have the homelessness.
Yeah.
But the more I housed people, because I would go in and see them. Christmas, I've even taken my children with me and visited some of the folks that we've housed because that's where the bond is. Your heart just shines when you are able to, but then you see the struggles that they go through, and you have to work through those, and it's going to take time. And I have not done like an empirical study, but I can say that for some folks that have been homeless for quite some time, it takes at least a year to get used to living in four walls.
Yeah. It's like if you, it's kind of like your first college roommate. You get that first week is just so weird because you're used to living with your parents and, and they do things a certain way and you just become accustomed to them. And then all of a sudden there's another entity in the house and they're not doing anything according to your script. And you either can get past that or you can't. So the issue with the chronic homeless, the person that's coming in, you said 2, 3 times recurring. It seems like they're further down that path of not being able to kind of like not be able to be comfortable being in what our society would deem normal.
Yeah, but
is that right?
What is normal?
Yeah, what is normal? But you know what I mean.
No, I do know what you mean. And so a lot of it is beyond. It's not just getting a job, and we all know that minimum wage is not going to land you anywhere. Yeah. In an appointment, in an apartment. And so it's beyond that. It's the folks that are the chronically homeless is really working on their mental health status and getting their medications right. And some maybe haven't been on meds for years.
Yeah.
And so stabilizing on their medication is huge. And that's that continuity, and then their brain starts to come back, and then you're like, oh, there's that guy again, and
the stuff you're describing is kind of like what families provide to people in their family that might be having issues, right? So I think a lot of times maybe people take that for granted and don't realize, like, picture that whatever it is you're going through, if you're having a problem and if you couldn't call your mom or you couldn't talk to your spouse or, you know, whatever it is, if there's no net there, how would you function? Like, how do you deal with that? You know, and if it continues over time where you get more and more isolated, your only person you can talk to is yourself in your head. So you game stuff out in your head, and then it just kind of snowballs from there. Is that?
Yeah. I get what you're saying. I know that there's other opinions also. But, you know, I look at so many stories. There was a gentleman that was 38 years old, and he was, his parents died when he was young, and he was in the custody of his grandma, and she died, and he was put into group homes. And then when he turned 18, he was just put out on the street. And he was homeless for 20 years here in Chico on the street. Sweetest man ever. And we worked to get him housed. My staff at the shelter, just before we were 24/7, would just let him stay in, you know, and so he could sleep and heal and eat and not use drugs. And he had a cognitive delay. So there's no chance of him ever getting a job. System right out failed him. I got him housed, and a year later he died. 39 years old. It was heart-wrenching. So there's many different reasons why people become homeless. It's people that have been through the regional centers, that have disabilities, that will never have the life skills to live on their own. Why are they on the streets? I don't know. We don't have board and care facilities. I mean, there's so many gaps that us little service providers can't fill, because that has to come from the feds or you know, the state. So, I mean, we're only working with what we've got, and that's not a whole lot. And so we need to have our leaders locally and nationally step up, you know, have mental hospitals open again. We don't have detox centers, you know, so a lot of people like to point fingers at us service providers as saying we're not doing enough. But I'll tell you that, you know, we're working our tails off, because I live in this community too. Yeah. And, you know, when I'm driving down the street and I can, you know, see people that I know that are in my lives daily walk in the streets because they have nowhere to go. And I want to solve that. Yeah.
I mean, your point about a federal mental health system, I 100% agree with you. We do need that. I think there was one in the 50s, and then it got shut down for, you know, humanitarian reasons by and large, but we do need a flavor of that. It needs to be obviously managed way differently, but there's no outlet for that right now. And, you know, the worst of the worst end up on the banks of the rivers, you know, and cause we don't currently have a system in place to deal with that part of the population, the homeless population, that is, I would say, unsolvable. You know, I think, would you agree? I mean, I don't think there's any kind of policy is going to eradicate homelessness. I think this is a thing that's always going to be there, that we have to have some infrastructure in order to deal with. You know, just like we have, dams to manage water. Mm-hmm. We need some sort of a system at the federal level to deal with this. I think it's an opportunity for, you know, the Chico community to put some stuff in place that can maybe be used for templates outside of the area. Like I'm really encouraged to hear about you guys getting all in the same case management system, because I think that's fundamentally step one. So that's awesome. Obviously the passion's there, which is step two.
Yeah.
It's really just getting people on board. There's this idea of, if you provide lots of homeless services, that more homeless people will show up. And part of me tends to agree. I get worried that's part of it, because it seems to be like water. If water is by its nature fills empty spots, and if you've got, if we added, you can do how many beds right now? 160. If you doubled your capacity, all the homeless people in Chico were taken care of, would 50 more show up, and 100 more show up, and 200 more? And I think a lot of people in the community, that's what they worry about. This is why I feel like at a federal level, it's got to come down at a federal level, because it can't happen in pockets. Because of this water analogy, people will go to where the services are, because there's no better substitute.
So if you look at it holistically, though, within the state of California, for instance, the governor is releasing a ton of money towards this. And it's not like all that money is going to come to Chico.
Right.
And we're only 100,000 people. So in my opinion, it's going to go across the whole state of California. I'm working with Tehama County on opening a low barrier shelter. You would think that those cities on the I-5 corridor would have higher homeless rates than the city of Chico.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Just based on accessibility.
Right?
Yep.
But Chico, we're just this little island. And so comparatively speaking, with this funding coming down, every region will be making their services more robust. And so people, if they don't have, they may not be like looking to find other services, because it's going to be there in their hometown. Yeah.
And that's good. I'm glad to hear that on, say, a city level, right? But what I'm concerned with is, what's to keep somebody from Nevada sending a busload of people into California, because the services are better, right? So
actually, Reno's services are better.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Okay, probably a bad state to make a comparison to, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, this is part of the I think the anxiety with a lot of the 99% of the population that is affected by this in Chico. It's like, even if you do ratchet it up to the state level, if the other 49 states aren't on board, then California becomes kind of the obvious place to ship your homeless population to, and just kick the can down the road. That's why I feel like it needs to be done at a state or at a federal level in all 50.
And the feds are very vested in this very topic. And I have an incredible connection with the federal government of HUD. And they know and they watch of what's going on. That's why we have technical assistance here right now, to try to mitigate and get our system streamlined.
Yeah.
But the other, argument to that is that not the bus issue of dropping people off, but human migration is natural. And so, we are always looking, whether we're looking for a better house or a better job, and we're going to move to where the job is. So whether people are doing that to better their lives, if they're in one community and they're going to go to another community to better their lives, we all do that in one way, shape, or form. We move it to an area. I lived in Irvine. We picked Irvine because it had the most amazing schools and it was safe.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that people do that naturally.
Yeah, but my counter to what you're saying, though, is that your selection criteria are far different than, say, somebody that might be in New York that heard there's better social services in Chico, therefore they come out. They're not coming out based on better education or anything else. It's literally like, hey, the services are better. The community here is more willing to accept us and embrace us. Let's just go there because life will be easier. I get what you're saying. Yeah, people are people are transient in nature, because I think we've evolved that way. I mean, from the time we were cavemen, but it's this problem. If there's any gaps in the system, social strata, or the social lattice, if you will, of, from a homeless perspective, those spots are going to be filled, and they're going to,
every person has a right to better their lives.
I fully agree with you. I totally agree with you.
But I can tell you that in all the conversations that I've had, maybe just a handful of folks whether they're shelter hoppers,
yeah,
not the extreme amounts that people claim.
Yeah.
And then and us as service providers, our number one question is, there's no housing. So there's nothing we can do really beyond sheltering you.
Yep.
Do you have family and friends somewhere else that you would like to relocate to and be successful? And we've gotten actually a big turnout, and
That's good.
And then we help get him a bus ticket. I mean, I just got a request to send someone, I don't know, back east. And so it's a 6-day Greyhound. But I'm like, I'm all for it,
Yeah. And yeah, I get it. Like, people are going to go to where, and they rightly should, because it's their human right, go to where they're personally, whatever their criteria is for success is going to be the most highest degree of likelihood to happen. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that. It was mostly like a devil advocate thing, because I understand the value you guys are adding, but there's a large contingent of the population, especially in Chico, that we're all feeling the pain. We're all feeling it in our own little worlds right now. And it's, the perception is a reality. So, as they say. So,
yes. And I understand where they're coming from. I get it. I see both sides, because I want to be safe. I want my children to be safe. I want my friends and family to be safe. And so I'm working hard to ensure that. I'm not here to enhance and increase the population just for job security.
Right.
I would hope that maybe one day I wouldn't have a job.
Yeah. And I know you would gladly put yourself out of work if you could.
For sure.
Yeah.
So it's not an industry by any means. Yeah. And
I think I would argue that there's probably pockets in the U.S. that treat it like that, though. You can't assume, you can't make a statement like that and assume that everybody's in it for the same reasons you are. There's people in the conservation area that necessarily may be driven by profit more than, say, actually moving the conservation needle forward. I see that in my community in certain places. So I get what you're saying, that there's always outliers, though, where it's going to be counter. And those, unfortunately, the outliers are the ones that drive a lot of the negative perceptions of whatever it is we're trying to do.
Right. So I would like to say, because I know our time is coming to an end, that I agree with transparency is huge. Educating the general public of what we do and why we do it. And if they have a question, I welcome them to email me at joy@torresshelter.org. I can share my data, and I do, but it's just, individual requests are fine. I saw, what people were posting, for you to ask us service providers, and all of that is open, and I welcome, anything to help ease their mind. Yeah. I do want to say that we do share our data with Chico PD and Parks every night. They get an email. They know what our census is. They know how many beds we have open.
Yeah, and talk about that a little bit, because I wanted to mention that. I forgot. You were telling me about you have a relationship with the Chico PD, and what happens like every night.
Every night we send out an email to dispatch and their sergeants and patrol, and they know what our census is. So at night, if they come across someone, they know that we have an opening. And then I've also put out there that even if we are full and they find someone that wants shelter, to just bring them, because we're at 160, our fire code is 192.
You can put a cot up.
I could put, one or two.
Yeah.
It's more of a staffing security ratio that we have that number. And so, I mean, I go out and do outreach with the target team. I am on speed dial with the police all the time, just in communication, as well as the combo that they have with behavioral health that goes out with them. We're constantly trying to make these citizens better human beings and get them what they need. And so, I mean, open transparency is my mission.
Yeah. And just to make a more stronger connection with the reason you share bed counts with the PD is that in a case where it's 2 a.m. and Chico PD clips somebody at night and they need to put them in the can for whatever reason, rather than tie up the jail facility and all the emergency response staff needed for that, they can route them to you for the evening, assuming that they're not going crazy, and park them there for the night.
Just drop them off. Yeah.
So that's good.
I do want to make a statement about how passionate everyone is. And I think people's passion can get heated, just as it did at that forum.
Yeah. Geez.
And I will not entertain that kind of passion, because this is, we have to be civil in order to be able to at least try to solve this problem.
Yeah, and this particular one, I don't even know if it's healthy or even productive to have that type of a setting, have that type of that sort of that format. I think that the key players in town need to meet closed session without the community there, and kind of like the gladiator arena, and you're already going in pretty tuned up, and now if 25% of the audience is in line with one of the speakers, a shitstorm ensues, which we saw at this Chico the Chico thing. It's a fucking joke, really, watching it. What I would recommend is meet in a closed door session, come up with a plan, and then talk to the public about it. Don't try and form policy in a public setting on this type of a issue. I just don't think it's a good use of anybody's time.
It's unhealthy.
In fact, I would argue I'm not even sure they were trying to form a public policy in that.
Yeah, it wasn't public
setting.
Policy. It was
I don't know
opinion.
what it was. It was a waste of time. Yeah. But anyway, thanks for coming on. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate it. I know that it was probably a little I don't know if scary is the right word, but the thing is called the AMP Business Podcast, and I wanted the homelessness issue in Chico is one of the key things I think for the local economy to have to parse and work through, and I think the only way it's going to be solved is with mutual respect for each other, but also transparency and honesty. And if everybody's on the same page and the goal is to, reduce the homelessness issue in Chico as much as possible, that's where you start. But anyway,
I wholeheartedly agree.
And I've got 4 more hours of interviews to do, probably, until we put a button on this one. And I might just make the first season this. But really appreciate you coming in, Joy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And my dog's like jumping all over you, so guess he wants a walk. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please rate us on iTunes and Google Play. We'll be back.
This podcast has been brought to you by AMP.build, a software and digital design agency located in Chico, California. Learn more at www.amp.build. If you have ideas or questions for the show, send an email to hello@amp.build. We may air it on the next show.